The dark truth. The lives of homosexuals in the U.S. military. The bullet that should have killed Marcus Chen missed his heart by 2 inches, but the words his squad leader whispered as he dragged him to safety hit their mark perfectly. I know what you are, and after this everyone else will too. 6 months earlier, Marcus had been just another Marine exceptional only in his ability to remain invisible while excelling at everything the Corps demanded of him, from marksmanship to marathon runs, from tactical planning to the 1,000 small acts of brotherhood that held a unit together in the unforgiving heat of Afghanistan. He had learned early that survival meant more than dodging bullets. It meant dodging questions about girlfriends back home, meant laughing at jokes that made his stomach turn, meant becoming a master of pronouns when talking about the person whose photo he kept hidden in his wallet behind his military ID. That person was James, though Marcus had trained himself never to think the name during daylight hours, as if thoughts themselves could betray him in the hypermasculine world of Force Recon. They had met at a bookstore in Oceanside, both reaching for the same copy of Hemingway, both freezing when their hands touched, both recognizing something in the other's eyes that was equal parts fear and hope. James was a Navy corpsman stationed at Camp Pendleton, which meant they understood each other's world in ways civilians never could, but also meant their relationship carried dangers that went beyond the ordinary risks of military service. Under Don't. Ask, don't tell. Their love was not just forbidden, but potentially career-ending, a secret that could transform decorated service members into discharged pariahs with a single revelation. They developed elaborate protocols for their meetings, never arriving at the same location together, always maintaining plausible cover stories, treating their relationship like a covert operation where the enemy was anyone who might report them up the chain of command. Marcus became an expert at calculating risk versus reward, measuring every gesture and glance against the possibility of exposure, learning to live with a constant low-grade fear that was somehow worse than the adrenaline spike of combat. The irony was that Marcus was considered one of the best Marines in his battalion, the kind of operator other guys wanted on their 6 when things went sideways. He had earned a Bronze Star for pulling 3 wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee, had been recommended for Force Recon by commanders who praised his leadership and dedication, had bled for his country on 3 separate deployments. Yet all of that could be erased by the simple fact of who he loved, as if his sexuality somehow negated his service, as if the bullets he had taken were less real because of the secret he carried. His squad leader, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, was the kind of Marine who seemed born for combat, all sharp edges and barely contained violence, the type who collected confirmed kills like baseball cards and told stories about his conquests, both military and sexual, with equal enthusiasm. Marcus had served under him for 18 months without incident, had earned what he thought was respect through competence and courage, had even started to believe that maybe he could make it through his enlistment without anyone discovering the truth. That illusion shattered the night Rodriguez found him looking at a photo of James during what should have been a private moment in their forward operating base. The photo was innocent enough, just James in civilian clothes standing on the Oceanside pier. But something in the way Marcus looked at it, some unguarded expression of longing that crossed his face in that unobserved moment, told Rodriguez everything he needed to know. Marcus saw the recognition dawn in his squad leader's eyes, saw the disgust that followed it, saw the calculation that came next. Rodriguez didn't say anything that night, just smiled in a way that made Marcus' skin crawl and walked away, leaving him to wonder when the axe would fall. For 3 weeks, nothing happened, and Marcus almost convinced himself that he had misread the situation, that Rodriguez would keep his suspicions to himself out of unit loyalty, if nothing else. He threw himself into his duties with renewed intensity, volunteered for every dangerous patrol, pushed himself harder in training, as if exemplary performance could somehow shield him from what he feared was coming. James noticed the change during their brief stolen phone calls, heard the strain in his voice, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to explain that their carefully constructed world might be about to collapse. Then came the mission that changed everything, a night raid on a suspected insurgent safehouse in Helmand Province. Marcus was on Point Rodriguez right behind him when they kicked in the door and found themselves in a kill box, Taliban fighters opening up from concealed positions with automatic weapons. In the chaos that followed, Marcus did what he always did in combat, stopped thinking and started reacting, muscle memory and training taking over as bullets snapped past his head. He cleared 2 rooms, single-handedly put down 3 enemy combatants, and was moving to secure the stairs when he felt the impact that spun him around and dropped him to the dusty floor. The pain came in waves radiating from his chest, where the bullet had punched through his body armor at an angle, finding a gap in the ceramic plates. Marcus had been shot. Before the drill knew to keep fighting until he physically couldn't anymore. But this felt different, felt final in a way that made him think of James and all the things they would never get to say to each other. Rodriguez was suddenly there, dragging him toward cover, and that's when he leaned in close and whispered those words that hurt worse than the bullet. "I know what you are, and after this everyone else will too." What followed was a fever dream of medevac helicopters and field hospitals, of morphine and emergency surgery, of drifting in and out of consciousness, while machines beeped and medical personnel moved around him like ghosts. Marcus survived, though the doctors said it was closer than anyone wanted to admit, the bullet having nicked an artery before lodging near his spine. He woke up in Germany, weak and disoriented, to find his commanding officer standing at the foot of his bed with an expression that told him Rodriguez had made good on his threat. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless military justice at its most efficient. Rodriguez testified that he had observed behavior consistent with homosexual conduct. Other squad members suddenly remembered things they had overlooked before, and someone Marcus never found out who discovered emails between him and James that were circumspect but damning when read with suspicious eyes. The fact that Marcus was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from wounds received in combat, didn't slow the process. If anything, it seemed to accelerate it, as if the Marine Corps was eager to purge this embarrassment before he could become a hero in the media. James was investigated too, his career destroyed by association, though they were kept from communicating during the proceedings. Marcus learned later that James had been given an other-than-honorable discharge, his plans to use his GI benefits for medical school evaporating along with his military career. The knowledge that he had destroyed the life of the person he loved most, cut deeper than any physical wound, left scars that no surgery could repair. Marcus was offered a deal, a general discharge under honorable conditions, if he went quietly. No formal court-martial, no federal conviction. Just the end of everything he had worked for since he was 18 years old. He took it because fighting would have meant a public trial, would have meant his parents learning the truth from newspapers, instead of from him, would have meant dragging other gay service members into the spotlight. The Marine Corps took his uniforms, his medals, his identity, and sent him back to a civilian world that suddenly felt as foreign as any combat zone. The homecoming was brutal in its mundanity. Marcus found himself standing in his childhood bedroom in Sacramento, surrounded by high school trophies and Marine Corps memorabilia, trying to figure out who he was without the uniform that had defined him for 6 years. His parents struggled to understand why their war hero son had been discharged, accepting his vague explanations about personality conflicts and changing priorities with confusion and disappointment. The local news had run a story about his Bronze Star the year before. Neighbors still thanked him for his service when he went to buy groceries, and every well-meaning gesture felt like salt in an open wound. Finding work proved harder than expected. The skills that made him an exceptional Marine, the ability to breach doors and clear rooms, to call in airstrikes and lead men in combat, didn't translate easily to civilian employment. His discharge papers raised questions he couldn't honestly answer in job interviews, and the gap between his obvious competence and his sudden separation from the military told its own story to anyone paying attention. He took a job at a hardware store, then as a security guard, then at a gym, each position feeling like a step further away from the person he used to be. The worst part was the isolation. In the Marines, he had been part of something larger than himself, bound to his brothers by shared purpose and mutual dependence. Now he was alone, with his secret cut off from the military community that had been his world, unable to share his experiences with civilians who couldn't understand what he had lost. He tried attending a veterans support group, but found himself unable to speak honestly about why he was there. The other veterans assuming he was struggling with combat trauma rather than institutional betrayal. It was 3 months after his discharge when James found him showing up at his apartment door looking thin and tired, but still beautiful in the way that made Marcus' heart race. They hadn't spoken since the investigation began, military lawyers advising against any contact that could be construed as evidence of an ongoing relationship. Seeing him there real and present after months of forced separation broke something open in Marcus that he had been holding together through sheer force of will. They talked through the night, sharing their parallel experiences of investigation and discharge of dreams deferred and futures destroyed. James had moved back to Oregon, was working as an EMT while figuring out how to pay for medical school without military benefits. He had driven 12 hours straight to find Marcus, following breadcrumbs of information from mutual friends who were willing to risk association with discharged service members. The courage that took the loyalty it demonstrated reminded Marcus of why he had fallen in love with this man in the first place. They decided to move in together, pooling their resources and their trauma, building something new from the wreckage of their military careers. It wasn't easy, both of them carrying wounds that went beyond the physical, both struggling with anger and depression and the sense of betrayal that came from being cast out by the institution they had served faithfully. There were nights when Marcus woke up gasping, not from combat flashbacks, but from dreams where he was still a Marine, still belonged somewhere, only to face the crushing reality of his discharge with each dawn. But there was also healing in finally being able to live openly, to hold James' hand in public without calculating sightlines, and escape routes to use real names and pronouns when talking about their relationship. They found a community of other LGBTQ veterans who understood their specific brand of loss, who had their own stories of service and sacrifice and rejection. These connections, tentative at first, grew into friendships that provided the kind of support they had once found in military units, proving that brotherhood and sisterhood could transcend official institutions. The repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell came too late for Marcus and James, a bitter victory that allowed others to serve openly while offering nothing to those who had already been cast out. They watched the news coverage together, saw active duty service members celebrating in uniform, and felt a complex mix of joy for those who would be spared their experience and rage at the timing that had destroyed their careers for something that was no longer considered incompatible with military service. Marcus threw himself into advocacy work, channeling his anger into action, speaking at colleges and conferences about the cost of discrimination in the armed forces. He told his story again and again, not for sympathy, but for change, hoping that his experience might prevent others from suffering the same fate. It was during one of these speaking engagements that he met Colonel Sarah Williams, a JAG officer who was working to help discharged LGBTQ veterans upgrade their discharge statuses in the wake of the policy change. The process was Byzantine and frustrating, requiring Marcus to relive his discharge through documentation and testimony to prove that his separation was based solely on his sexuality, rather than any legitimate military reason. James went through the same process, both of them spending months gathering evidence and filing paperwork, aided by lawyers who volunteered their time to help veterans reclaim some measure of justice. The military bureaucracy moved at its typical glacial pace, requests disappearing into black holes, responses coming months after submission, each step forward followed by 2 steps back. It was during this waiting period that Marcus got the call that changed everything. Rodriguez had been killed in Afghanistan, stepped on an IED during a patrol in the same province where Marcus had been shot. The news hit Marcus with unexpected force, not grief exactly, but something more complex, a recognition that the man who had destroyed his career was gone, taking with him any chance of confrontation or closure. Other members of his old squad reached out, men who had stood silent during his investigation, now expressing regret and support the passage of time, and changing social attitudes, allowing them to see their complicity in what had happened. One of them, Lance Corporal Thompson, sent Marcus a package containing something unexpected. Rodriguez's personal effects included a journal where he had written about his suspicions regarding several Marines in the battalion, not just Marcus. The entries revealed a man obsessed with rooting out what he saw as weakness and perversion in the ranks, convinced that gay Marines were a threat to unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. But there were also entries from after Marcus was shot, expressing something that might have been guilt, or at least uncertainty about his actions, wondering if a Marine who had saved lives and bled for his country deserved to be destroyed for who he loved. Marcus shared the journal with his lawyer, who added it to his discharge upgrade petition as evidence of bias and discrimination. It was a strange form of vindication proof that his discharge had been motivated by prejudice rather than any failure on his part as a Marine. James received similar supporting evidence from corpsmen who had served with him, men and women willing to testify that he had been an exemplary sailor whose only crime was loving another man. The hearings, when they finally came, were held in nondescript government buildings, bureaucratic proceedings that bore no resemblance to the dramatic courts-martial of military movies. Marcus sat in a conference room with his lawyer presenting his case to a panel of officers who seemed more interested in paperwork than justice. He told his story one more time, voice steady, despite the emotions churning beneath the surface, laying out his service record, his commendations, his wounds, and the single reason for his discharge. James' hearing was held separately, but the process was the same, a careful presentation of evidence that his military service had been exemplary in every way, except for his sexuality. Both of them emphasized their desire to serve their pride in their military identities, their sense of loss at being forced out of the profession they had loved. The panel members listened with expressions that gave nothing away, asking procedural questions that seemed designed more to fill out forms than to understand the human cost of the policy they were reviewing. The waiting was the worst part, months passing with no word while their petitions worked through the system. Marcus continued his advocacy work, he and James building a life together that was good, if not what they had originally planned. They adopted a dog, a German Shepherd mix, who had washed out of military working dog training, finding comfort in giving a home to another creature deemed not quite suitable for service. They hiked and traveled, explored careers that had nothing to do with the military, learned to find identity and purpose outside the uniform. When the letters finally came, they arrived on the same day, twin envelopes bearing the Department of Defense seal that made both men freeze with recognition. They opened them together, hands shaking slightly, reading the bureaucratic language that took several paragraphs to deliver the verdict. Both discharge characterizations had been upgraded to fully honorable, their records corrected to reflect that they had served with distinction until separated for reasons that were no longer considered valid. It was a victory, but a complicated one. The upgrades restored their benefits, allowed them to call themselves veterans without qualification, provided a measure of official vindication. But it couldn't give them back the years lost. The careers ended the sense of belonging that had been ripped away. Marcus found himself crying for the first time since his discharge, not from joy, but from a grief that finally had permission to exist, mourning the Marine he could have been if born in a different time, or if the policy had changed just a few years earlier. The benefits made a practical difference, at least. James was able to use his restored GI Bill to finally attend medical school, pursuing his dream of becoming a doctor with the same determination he had once brought to combat medicine. Marcus went back to school too, studying counseling with a focus on helping LGBTQ veterans navigate the challenges of military service and its aftermath. They moved to Seattle, finding a community that embraced them, fully building friendships with civilians and veterans alike who saw them as whole people rather than symbols or political talking points. Their wedding was held on a beach in Oregon, a small ceremony attended by family who had come to understand and accept them friends from their military and civilian lives, and a surprising number of active duty service members who drove hours to show their support. Marcus wore his dress blues, the uniform he had thought he would never put on again, medals, including his Bronze Star and Purple Heart, gleaming in the sunset light. James wore his navy whites, the corpsman insignia he had earned through combat service restored to its rightful place. The ceremony itself was simple vows exchanged that acknowledged their journey from hidden love to public commitment from service members forced to lie to veterans standing in their truth. When they kissed, it was not just as husbands, but as men who had paid a steep price for the right to love openly, who had survived both enemy fire and institutional prejudice, who had found their way back to each other despite every obstacle placed in their path. The reception was held at a veterans' hall, a deliberate choice that would have been impossible during their service. They danced to songs that had played in Afghanistan and Iraq, surrounded by people who understood that their love story was also a war story, that their commitment had been tested in ways most couples could never imagine. Active duty gay and lesbian service members approached them throughout the night, sharing their own stories of serving, openly expressing gratitude for those who had paid the price for their freedom. Marcus gave a speech that night, thanking their guests, but also addressing the ghosts in the room. The service members who hadn't survived either combat or the psychological toll of hiding their identities, the ones who had been discharged and never found their way back, the ones still serving in countries where being gay remained a crime punishable by death. He spoke of Rodriguez, too, surprising himself with an expression of forgiveness for a man whose own limitations had caused so much pain, recognizing that they were all products of the system that had shaped them. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself standing outside with a young Marine corporal who had driven up from Camp Pendleton, a gay man serving openly in the same unit Marcus had been forced to leave. The young Marine asked questions about combat and leadership, but also about how to navigate being different in an institution that valued conformity, how to maintain authenticity while meeting military standards. Marcus found himself giving advice he wished someone could have given him strategies for thriving, rather than just surviving reminders that sexuality was just one part of a complex identity that included warrior and protector and leader. The years that followed brought their own challenges and victories. James excelled in medical school, his military experience giving him advantages in trauma surgery rotations, his understanding of battlefield medicine translating surprisingly well to civilian emergency rooms. Marcus built a successful practice counseling veterans, specializing in those dealing with identity issues and institutional trauma, becoming known as someone who understood the specific challenges of military service from the inside. They bought a house with a view of Puget Sound, filling it with photographs from their military service, alongside pictures from their life together, creating a visual narrative that refused to separate their past from their present. The dog they had adopted became a certified therapy animal, accompanying Marcus to work with veteran clients who found it easier to talk with a fellow warrior creature present. They hosted dinners for LGBTQ veterans, creating the kind of community support they had wished for during their own transitions. Advocacy remained important to both of them, though it took different forms as the years passed. James focused on improving healthcare for LGBTQ veterans, working to ensure that VA hospitals provided competent and respectful treatment, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. Marcus continued speaking at events, but also began writing first articles, then a book about his experiences trying to capture not just the pain of discrimination, but the complex reality of loving both military service and a person the military said you couldn't. They returned to Camp Pendleton for the first time a decade after their discharges, invited to speak at a diversity and inclusion event that would have been unthinkable during their service. Walking through the gates in civilian clothes felt surreal, the familiar sights and sounds triggering muscle memory of a life lived in uniform. The audience was mostly young Marines and sailors, many of whom had never served under discriminatory policies, who listened with surprise and sometimes disbelief as Marcus and James described what military service had been like when being gay was grounds for discharge. After the formal presentation, they were approached by a staff sergeant who looked familiar despite the years that had passed. It was Thompson the Marine who had sent Rodriguez's journal, now a senior NCO, responsible for training the next generation of warriors. He apologized for his silence during the investigation, explained how the incident had changed his perspective on leadership and integrity, how he now made sure his Marines understood that diversity was a strength rather than a weakness. It was a conversation Marcus never expected to have, a form of closure that came not from confrontation, but from growth and change. The trip to Pendleton also included a visit to the base hospital where James had worked, where some of the corpsmen who had served with him were now senior medical staff. They welcomed him back with the respect due a combat veteran interested in his medical career and proud that one of their own had overcome such obstacles. The senior chief, who had been forced to process James' discharge paperwork, pulled him aside to say he had never forgotten the injustice of it, had used that memory to ensure fair treatment for LGBTQ sailors under his supervision. These encounters, repeated in various forms over the years, helped heal wounds Marcus hadn't realized were still bleeding. Each person who acknowledged what had happened, who expressed regret for their action or inaction, who showed through changed behavior that progress was possible, added another stitch to the ragged holes left by institutional rejection. It didn't erase the pain or undo the damage, but it provided evidence that their suffering had not been entirely in vain, that their forced sacrifices had contributed to a better military for those who came after. The physical scars remained too. Marcus' chest bearing the permanent reminder of the night everything changed. The bullet wound ached in cold weather, a deep throb that brought back sense memories of dust and blood and Rodriguez's whispered threat. But like all his scars, visible and invisible, it had become part of his story rather than the defining element, evidence of survival rather than defeat. James had his own scars, psychological wounds from being forced to choose between career and authenticity, but together they had learned to see their damages as proof of resilience rather than weakness. Their life together became its own form of resistance, a daily refutation of the idea that gay men couldn't embody military values of courage and commitment and sacrifice. They volunteered with veteran organizations, mentored young LGBTQ people, considering military service, created scholarships for those whose benefits had been denied or stripped away. Every success, every moment of happiness, every contribution to their community felt like a small victory over the forces that had tried to erase them. Marcus often thought about the road not taken, the military career that might have been if he had been born later or if policies had evolved sooner. He might have made master sergeant or commissioned as an officer, might have led Marines in combat for decades, instead of years, might have retired with full honors after a complete career. But that alternate timeline would not have included James, would not have led to the life they built together, would not have positioned him to help others navigate the intersection of military service and LGBTQ identity. The anger never fully disappeared, surfacing at unexpected moments, like when he saw recruiting commercials that talked about honor and integrity while remembering how those values had been selectively applied. But it had transformed from a burning rage to a cooler determination, fuel for continued advocacy rather than self-destruction. He learned to carry his fury the way he had once carried a rifle, as a tool to be maintained and deployed strategically rather than a burden that weighed him down. 20 years after his discharge, Marcus received an unexpected invitation to return to his battalion for a reunion of Afghanistan veterans. He hesitated, unsure of his welcome among men who had known him before and during his forced exit from military life. James encouraged him to go, understanding that this was a chance to reclaim part of his identity that had been taken to stand among his brothers, not as a discharged pariah, but as a combat veteran who had earned his place through blood and service. The reunion was held at a hotel in Las Vegas, a gathering of middle-aged men trying to recognize each other beneath gray hair and civilian clothes. Marcus entered the ballroom with his heart racing, feeling more nervous than he had before combat missions, but the reception was warmer than he had dared hope. Marines he had served with greeted him with handshakes and embraces, introducing him to their wives with stories of his courage under fire, treating him like what he had always been, a brother who had stood with them in the worst of circumstances. The formal program included a memorial for those who hadn't made it home, including Rodriguez. Marcus stood with his former squad during the tribute, complicated emotions washing over him as they honored a man who had been both brother and betrayer. When it came time to share stories, several Marines spoke of Marcus' actions in combat, the lives he had saved, the leadership he had shown, pointedly emphasizing that he had been one of the best Marines they had served with, regardless of why his service had ended. Later in the hotel bar, fueled by alcohol and the emotion of reunion, some of the men apologized for their silence during his investigation. They spoke of regret and changing perspectives of gay sons and daughters who had helped them understand, of recognizing too late that they had failed to stand up for someone who had always stood up for them. Marcus accepted their apologies while recognizing that they came from a different world now, that the men who had stayed silent were not the same as the men expressing regret 20 years later. One conversation stood out with his former platoon commander, who had been a lieutenant during Marcus' service and was now a retired colonel. He told Marcus that losing him had been one of his greatest failures as a leader, that he should have fought harder against the investigation, should have valued proven combat effectiveness over outdated prejudices. He had spent years thinking about what he could have done differently, had made sure throughout the rest of his career that no Marine under his command faced discrimination for their sexuality, had tried to honor Marcus' service by protecting others from the same fate. The reunion ended with promises to stay in touch that were actually kept social media connections and email threads that included Marcus as naturally as any other veteran of their shared experience. It was a form of reintegration he hadn't expected, a closing of circles that had been violently broken 2 decades earlier. He returned to Seattle with a sense of peace that had long eluded him, not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance that his story was part of a larger narrative of change and progress. James had his own moments of reconciliation, invited to speak at Navy medical training about the importance of inclusive care and the cost of discrimination. He stood before audiences of corpsmen and told his story, emphasizing not just the personal toll, but the loss to military medicine when qualified providers were forced out for irrelevant reasons. Young sailors approached him afterward with questions and gratitude, some sharing their own identities, others simply expressing commitment to being better leaders than those who had come before. Their advocacy work evolved as policies changed and new challenges emerged. Marriage equality, transgender service, the ongoing fight for full recognition and support of LGBTQ veterans became their focus. They testified before Congress about the need to correct military records and restore benefits, worked with veterans organizations to ensure inclusive services, pushed for accountability for past discrimination while celebrating current progress. Every small victory felt personal, every step forward a validation of their struggle. The day Marcus received his corrected DD-214, the official military discharge document that now accurately reflected his honorable service, he framed it next to his Bronze Star citation. These documents, side by side, told the complete story of his military experience, the heroism and the injustice, the service and the discrimination, the pride and the pain that were all part of his identity as a veteran. James did the same with his papers, creating a display that honored both their service and their survival. They aged together, bodies bearing the accumulated damage of military service and civilian struggle, but finding joy in freedoms that had once seemed impossible. They traveled to countries where being gay was celebrated rather than criminalized, attended military weddings of same-sex couples who could serve openly, watched with pride as LGBTQ service members advanced to senior ranks that had been barred to their generation. Each milestone felt like a personal victory, proof that their forced sacrifices had contributed to meaningful change. Marcus sometimes spoke to ROTC cadets and Service Academy students, sharing his story with future military leaders who would shape the force's culture. He emphasized that diversity was a tactical advantage, that excluding capable people for irrelevant characteristics weakened military readiness, that true leadership meant standing up for all troops, regardless of personal beliefs. The young officers listened with attention that gave him hope, asking thoughtful questions about balancing authenticity with military bearing, about leading diverse units in combat situations. One question came up repeatedly: would he do it again, knowing how it would end? Marcus' answer evolved over the years, but ultimately settled on yes, he would still serve because his love of country and commitment to defending it were not dependent on that country's acceptance of him. He had been a United States Marine, had bled for his nation, had embodied military values, even when military policies failed to value him. That identity could not be taken away by discharge papers or discrimination. It was earned in combat and sealed in sacrifice. The question of whether he would do it again always led to another. Did he regret his relationship with James, given what it had cost them both? That answer never wavered. Love was not something to regret, even when it came with a steep price. Their relationship had survived investigations and discharges, poverty and struggle, the transformation from hidden secret to public commitment. It had grown stronger through adversity, proved more resilient than the institutions that had tried to destroy it. As they entered their 50s, Marcus and James found themselves elder statesmen in the LGBTQ veteran community, called upon for wisdom and historical perspective. They mentored young veterans struggling with identity issues, provided resources for those fighting discharge upgrades, created support networks for those who felt caught between military and LGBTQ communities. Their home became a gathering place for holiday dinners and crisis interventions for celebrations and grief for all the messy complexity of lives lived at intersections. They also found unexpected joy in ordinary things that had once seemed impossible, holding hands at the grocery store, listing each other as emergency contacts without fear, attending military balls as a married couple. These simple acts of visibility, unremarkable to younger generations, carried weight for those who remembered when such openness could end careers. Every public display of affection was both personal expression and political statement, evidence that love had ultimately triumphed over fear. The physical toll of military service became more apparent with age, old injuries demanding attention, bodies breaking down from years of carrying heavy loads over rough terrain. Marcus' back problems from humping full combat loads through Afghan mountains required surgery. James' knees gave out from years of running to casualties while wearing full gear. They navigated VA healthcare together, supporting each other through procedures and recovery, grateful for restored benefits that made treatment possible. During one of Marcus' hospital stays, a young nurse noticed his Bronze Star license plate and thanked him for his service. When she saw James' wedding ring and understood their relationship, she mentioned that her wife was also a veteran serving openly in the Air Force. It was a casual revelation that would have been unthinkable during their service, delivered without drama or fear, simply one veteran family to another. These moments of normalized acceptance felt like gifts, proof that the world they had fought for was finally emerging. Their book, co-authored and published 15 years after their discharges, became recommended reading at several military institutions. Titled Serving in Silence, Fighting in Truth, it told their parallel stories of service and love, discrimination and resilience, loss and unexpected victory. They donated proceeds to organizations supporting LGBTQ veterans, funding legal assistance for discharge upgrades and mental health services for those struggling with identity and rejection. The book tour brought them to military bases across the country, speaking to audiences that included senior officers who had served during Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and junior troops who had never known discriminatory policies. The generational divide was stark: older service members, sometimes defensive about past actions or inactions, younger ones unable to fully grasp how recently and completely things had changed. Marcus and James navigated these dynamics carefully, emphasizing healing and progress over blame and bitterness. One stop was particularly meaningful, returning to the base where they had first met, where their relationship had begun in fear and secrecy. They walked the same streets they had once navigated with elaborate precautions, now openly together, hands clasped without concern for who might see. The bookstore where they had reached for Hemingway was gone, replaced by a coffee shop. But they stood in the space and remembered the terror and hope of that first touch, marveling at the journey that had brought them back. The speaking engagement at that base was attended by hundreds of service members and their families, including same-sex couples who served without hiding, who lived on base housing with their children, who received the same benefits and recognition as any military family. Seeing these families thriving where they had once hidden felt like looking into an alternate universe, one they had helped create through their suffering and advocacy. It was beautiful and painful, simultaneously joy for those who would never face their struggles, mixed with grief for what they had lost. Questions from the audience revealed how much had changed and how much remained constant about military service. Young troops asked about combat leadership and unit cohesion, about maintaining readiness and accomplishing missions, the same concerns that had always driven military culture. Their sexuality was largely irrelevant to these discussions, integrated into their identities without dominating them, exactly as Marcus and James had always wanted it to be. They were Marines and sailors first, who happened to be gay, rather than gay men who happened to serve. But there were also questions from LGBTQ service members about navigating predominantly straight military culture, about dealing with subtle discrimination that policy changes couldn't eliminate, about balancing authenticity with operational security in countries where being gay remained dangerous. Marcus and James shared hard-won wisdom about choosing battles and building alliances, about excellence as a shield and humor as a weapon, about finding community within community. One young Marine, a lesbian lance corporal who reminded Marcus of himself at that age, asked privately about dealing with family rejection. Her parents had disowned her for both her sexuality and her military service, unable to reconcile either with their expectations for their daughter. Marcus shared his own experience of coming out to his parents after his discharge, the difficult conversations and slow acceptance, the way his military service had ultimately helped them understand his courage and integrity. He gave her his contact information, adding her to the informal network of chosen family they had built over the years. The tour ended where their military service had effectively ended at the medical center where Marcus had recovered from his wounds and received his discharge papers. Now expanded and modernized, it bore little resemblance to the facility where he had lain wondering if Rodriguez would make good on his threat. They met with wounded warriors from recent conflicts, sharing stories of recovery, both physical and psychological, emphasizing that survival took many forms and that scars could become sources of strength. In the psychiatric ward, they spoke with service members struggling with various traumas, including some wrestling with identity issues in an officially accepting but still challenging military environment. Progress had not eliminated all problems. Policy changes had not erased prejudice, and young LGBTQ troops still faced unique challenges in balancing their authentic selves with military service. Marcus and James listened more than they spoke, recognizing their role as